Are bad units healthier for Genshin overall? Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Okay, so first things first. What is the purpose of adding a bad unit into the game? Now, here's the difficult thing. I don't think Hoyoverse goes out of their way to deliberately make bad units. Okay, considering Mizuki's state, that is questionable. But generally what tends to happen is whenever a unit releases, they're pretty good during their banner period, and then the cracks only really start to show over time. A great example of this would be Eula. She was really decent whenever she released, but over time, because physical was just kind of abandoned by Hoyoverse, she kinda fell out of relevancy and never crawled back into it, even though Hoyoverse has attempted to fix physical before through the means of characters like Mika. Or even a character like Sino, he released before Nihida, and the general rule of thumb is that every character that gets released before the main Archon of that region comes out, they're probably going to be massively buffed by the Archon of that region. Now this isn't always the case, as in Inazuma for example, Raiden Shogun was not doing anything for Ayaka or Yoimiya, but generally that has been the case since Sumeru, with the likes of Sino, Tainari, Hefli, and Nilou getting buffed up by Nihida, with the likes of Linny, Riesli, and Settle Down getting buffed up by our beloved Lady Farina. And then most recently we had Mawika buff up all of the Notlon cast and their teams. But Nihida didn't really save Sino's overall meta position. She was absolutely a buff to him, but his value on the whole remained pretty low. And those are two characters that came out with the intent of being good. I don't think Hoyoverse designed them wanting them to suck. Or a character that I consider to be really redundant, Ayato. With him, it's mostly a case of literally anybody else can play in his teams, but better. He is best in slot nowhere. His versatility, while he may have a lot of it, is practically useless in that regard, because literally any other character would do better in his slot. But once again, I don't think Hoyoverse made him for the specific purpose of being bad. It's more so that he didn't really evolve as the years went on, with the new metas that came along. With characters like Sino and Eula, it's mostly like gameplay issues. Eula's very backloaded, Sino has multi-wave problems, which have been solved if you just play him in Cheverse Overload teams in fairness, but they were very much prevalent for a couple of years there. And oftentimes, the inherent clunk of these units isn't worth putting up with, because the damage that you get in exchange for putting up with all of that usually isn't all that impressive. So it's almost kind of impossible to denote a purpose, an explicit, clear purpose for bad characters, because characters that end up being lower tier generally ended up that way for unfortunate circumstance. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe that Hoyoverse is capable of making bad characters for the sake of just making them bad, and that's what I'm interested in. I don't really know what was up with Dia, whether that was a failed kid experiment or whether she was destined to be bad from the very beginning. My guess is as good as yours. But Mizuki's the one that's got me thinking, does Hoyoverse ever deliberately make really terrible characters? And when they do so, what is the explicit purpose that these characters serve? Because while I don't think that Hoyo goes out of their way to make characters horrible on purpose, it is very, very clear that certain characters are always going to get a little bit more attention than others. For example, an Archon is obviously going to be way better than a random side character. And the main reason as to why I'm thinking about all of this is because of some comments that I got regarding Mizuki, about people saying how they're pretty happy that she's not very good, because now it means that they have some time to save their Primo Gems, and I found that very interesting. Because while I don't think that Hoyoverse has any specific vendetta against any specific one character, I do absolutely believe that they take advantage of the idea of break banners, essentially taking a relatively low demand character that isn't really sought after by that many people, their power level is kind of mid, maybe even below mid, and then they slot them in during a time that's kind of quiet so that people have time to build up Primo Gems again. For example, who remembers when Yoimiya got a rerun like 3 patches after her last one? They brought that girl back whenever they wanted a quick break banner, if you will. Or how they're bringing in Siegewein and Mizuki as Genshin 5.4's first half, 2 characters that absolutely less than 5% of the player base are pulling on, and that is being generous. Obviously, we're never going to know the exact statistics, but I would not be surprised if literally nobody was pulling on those banners. We've seen Hoyoverse do this many times before, it is not uncommon for them to do this, and I would say that the upcoming first half of 5.4 is a perfect example of that being the case. I'm not trying to say that Hoyoverse makes bad characters on purpose so that people have time to save. That's not the point I'm trying to make here. What I mean is that the result of some characters being undertuned is that Hoyoverse then has the materials to go and create banner phases like this. There's also another interesting thing that comes out of this. So I play Genshin, Honkai Star Rail, Wuthering Waves, and ZZZ. All of the big 4, right? Now, I'll say this about HSR, they release a good character every banner. It is very, very rare in which a new limited 5-star character is not that good. They all tend to be quite strong, at least A tier or above minimum, then they fall off pretty fast. But generally speaking, it feels like every single character is a must pull, and it's very hard to skip any certain unit. You can say for the Archon tier characters, but generally speaking, it still feels like most characters are a must. Now, I generally don't like the idea of any specific character being made really bad on purpose, because there's always going to be fans of that character. But it's a double-edged sword. If you make every character this busted behemoth that everybody needs to get, suddenly when a more mid character comes out, they're not gonna be that appealing. They're gonna be infinitely less appealing, in fact, compared to the rest of the cast. And there's never a period where you can save your currency and feel decent in doing so. Now, granted, obviously you should always pull for who you want, but if what people want are the best units, or all units that are A tier and above, or all units that are S tier and above, then it can be pretty hard to keep up with. So in that regard, having a few duds like Mizuki isn't the worst thing in the world, because at least it makes things a little bit easier to keep up with, especially after we just had Moika, Citlali, Arlecchino, and Clorox Bleach all in one patch. Like, that is a stacked patch. And I would say that all of Natlan has given us consistently really good releases. Mualani is insane. Kenichi is really good to me. Shilunen, she might as well be the Geo Sovereign because that's how good she is. And Chaska, despite being the worst of a Natlan unit in my opinion, is still a really decent unit. Because being the worst Natlan unit still means that you're quite good. Now, to me, I'm not necessarily happy at how bad Mizuki is because it's difficult. You want to really get a perfect middle ground with all of this. You want characters that are strong, they will work really well in their respective teams, but the meta is not moving so fast to a point where you cannot keep up with it. Fontaine was literally perfect at all of this. Every single character was really good, but they were all still within the same sort of power range. Was a C0-R1 Arlecchino better than a C0-R1 Linny? Yeah, but not by much if you're good at playing Linny. And while Navia is absolutely S tier these days, might I remind you that back then, she was a really high A tier DPS, because we didn't have 4-piece Intercity, we didn't have Kachina, we did have Chiori in fairness, and that was an upgrade to your teams, but it wasn't quite enough to push her into S tier. Clorox Bleach was quite underrated on release, but ended up proving herself to be a very versatile, effective DPS character. Even Riesli, a character who is on the lower end of the power spectrum, still ended up being quite decent. Because if you were to slot him into his best installed team at the time, that being himself, Bennett, Shangling, and our beloved Lady Farina, then he would have performed pretty good for you. Even Chiori, a character who I believe to be pretty bad at the time, I would say she turned out pretty good in the end. She has Shilunen as a teammate, her C1 is pretty good, and even if she's not the most high value pull in the world, you can absolutely make her work pretty competently these days. So while Fontaine definitely had its quote-unquote must-pull characters, I understand that there's no true must-pulls, but we did have our Novalettes, we did have our Lady Farinas, we did have our Arlecchinos and whatnot, but there were still a good handful of units that were really good while still being skippable. So it's for that reason that I personally don't think that we need bad characters, or that we can justify, terrible characters being added to the game, for this explicit purpose of being able to give players a break. Because if you think back to Fontaine, I would say that it was generally handled all very well. There weren't really any horrible releases. Okay, there was Siegeween. Siegeween was pretty terrible. But outside of Siegeween, everyone else was fine. And let's be real, Siegeween should have been a 4-star. I don't know why Siegeween is a 5-star. Nobody knows why Siegeween is a 5-star. She is most likely the least owned limited 5-star character in all of Genshin Impact. We'll never know what the thought process behind her was. And it was still pretty easy to keep up with the meta in Fontaine, because there were plenty of good 4-stars as well. Ga Ming was incredible. Chevreuse was really incredible. Her meta impact is still felt to this day. She unlocked Overload as a viable team option. That would have been an absolutely asinine idea before, but Chevreuse actually made it happen. Now granted, I'm not saying that I want every single character to be broken. I am not advocating for that whatsoever. I don't really want a Honkai Star Rail situation where every new character feels like the brand new ceiling, or the brand new, get them and you're absolutely a legend. But I do think that if they all have a high level of baseline competence, then we're pretty good to go. I don't really see any reason to suddenly make a really terrible character. Now I understand that Mizuki is a standout situation, and she shouldn't really be used as the status quo, because she is standard, and she is the first standard being designed, with standards being free later on in mind. So she is an exceptional case, if you will. Hoyoverse knows that they have to make her more constellation dependent for that specific reason. But when you take a look at worse characters on the whole, and you think, do we really need bad characters? Honestly, I think the answer is no. And to be fair, I think Genshin does a very good job at keeping older characters relevant. Like Ganyu recently getting a big melt upgrade with Moika. That was amazing. Or how Xiao, that character is over 5 years old now. He has been in the game since forever now, and he still feels quite good if you get all of the necessary equipment for him. Most well-liked old DPSs are kept as being about A tier, definitely safe to skip, but definitely still decent for people who still care about them. And you still achieve that same effect of having break banners. I don't really think there's any need to have totally dead banners. Now, once again, I believe that the first half of 5.4 is a very exceptional case. Like, that is a very exceptional case. But the main point that I'm trying to get across with all of this is that we don't really need terrible characters in order to have breaks. Every character should be decent at worst, and then absolutely broken is the best that they can be. It's interesting, because I do understand the sentiment of being relieved over 5.4's first half being so dead. 5.3 was hard on pretty much everyone. I think a very small percentage of the player base skipped over that patch in its entirety. Shoot, man, I myself don't mind that I'm getting a bit of time to build up my Primo funds again before Riesli drops. I tend to pull for every character, but come on. Siegeweed and Mizuki are a different level of bad. I think break banners are fine to have, and I find having bad releases preferable over having a meta that we can't realistically keep up with. That being said, in an ideal world, every unit is solid. But alas, where there is the desirable, there must also be the undesirable. But what do you think? Are bad characters actually pretty good to have around, or do you agree that their purpose is somewhat redundant? Let me know down below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, I have a ZZZ second channel. Head on over and subscribe if you're interested in some fun, silly ZZZ content. I'd also like to mention that I stream on Twitch. I stream once a week, every week on Saturdays, starting from 3 PM UK time. Come along so that we can play Wuthering Waves, ZZZ, and do some other fun stuff together. Hopefully this video was able to tell you why I personally think that Genshin doesn't need bad characters. This has been Juice, signing out, and listen man, as long as they make Skirk broken, I'm a happy camper. She's who I'm really setting my sights on next.